I didn't ruin my life. That's the strangest part. Nothing dramatic happened. No single decision destroyed everything. No moment where I could point and say, that's where it all went wrong. My life didn't collapse. It just passed. I woke up one morning with the unsettling feeling that I had been present for none of it. I had always believed that living a normal life was something to be grateful for. Stability. Routine. Predictability. I told myself that chaos was overrated and that wanting more was childish. So I learned to accept. I accepted jobs I didn't hate but didn't love. I accepted relationships that felt safe but never deep. I accepted days that were fine and years that were forgettable. Accepting became my main skill. People praised me for it. Called me grounded. Mature. Sensible. I took pride in being someone who didn't make reckless choices, who didn't chase illusions, who knew how to settle. I confused settling with wisdom. Life happened around me while I quietly adapted. Whenever I felt dissatisfaction, I explained it away. Everyone feels like this. Whenever envy appeared, I dismissed it. That's just unrealistic dreaming. Whenever a desire grew loud, I told myself it would fade. And it always did. Not because it was wrong, but because I ignored it long enough. Years went by without resistance. I showed up. I fulfilled expectations. I stayed functional. On paper, my life looked stable, even successful in small ways. Inside, it felt unfinished. But unfinished things are easy to ignore when they don't scream. They whisper. They whisper during long commutes. During quiet dinners. During nights when you lie awake wondering why you feel restless for no clear reason. I told myself I was lucky. That many people would trade places with me. That wanting more was ungrateful. So I stopped wanting. Or at least, I stopped listening. I let my life happen the way weather happens. One day blending into the next, seasons changing without my participation. I wasn't unhappy enough to leave, but never fulfilled enough to arrive. The scariest part was how reasonable it all felt. I wasn't suffering. I was numb. I avoided big choices because they felt unnecessary. Why disrupt something that works? Why risk losing what I had for something I wasn't even sure existed? That logic kept me safe. It also kept me still. I realized later that I had built my entire identity around non-decision. Around letting momentum choose for me. If I stayed long enough in any situation, it eventually became permanent. Not because I chose it. Because I didn't choose otherwise. I watched people around me change paths, make mistakes, reinvent themselves. I admired their courage quietly while telling myself I preferred peace. That drama wasn't for me. What I didn't admit was this: I was afraid. Afraid of choosing wrong. Afraid of wanting something I couldn't justify. Afraid of finding out that even if I tried, I might still fail. So I stayed where I was. Waiting for what, I never defined. Time passed politely at first. It didn't rush me. It didn't pressure me. It let me believe I had all of it. I trusted that belief without question. Until one day, it broke. Not with panic. With clarity. I was sitting alone, doing something ordinary, when a thought crossed my mind so clearly it felt spoken aloud. Is this it? Not is this bad? Not is this unbearable? Just, is this my life? I looked back, searching for moments I could hold on to. Milestones. Turning points. Decisions that felt like mine. What I found instead was a blur of adaptation. I hadn't been living deliberately. I had been reacting. And reaction, stretched over years, becomes a life you don't recognize as your own. That realization hurt in a way I wasn't prepared for. Because I couldn't blame anyone. There was no injustice to rage against. No tragedy to explain the emptiness. I had done everything right. And I felt nothing. That was the beginning of the breakdown. Not loud. Not visible. But irreversible. Once the question appeared, it didn't leave me alone. Is this it? I tried to ignore it at first. Treated it like an intrusive thought, something that would pass if I stayed busy enough. I filled my days with routine, my evenings with distraction. I told myself that everyone questions their life sometimes, that this was normal, that it meant nothing. But the question kept changing. It stopped asking if this was my life. It started asking why I had allowed it to become this. That's when the discomfort turned into something heavier. I began looking back, not nostalgically, but critically. I traced the years not by events, but by decisions I hadn't made. Times I stayed silent when something mattered. Moments I felt a pull toward change and reasoned my way out of it. Opportunities one didn't reject outright, but postponed until they quietly disappeared. I realized how often I had told myself I was being patient. Patient for the right moment. Patient for clarity. Patient for confidence. Patience had sounded noble. In reality, it had been avoidance dressed in maturity. I noticed how my life had narrowed without me noticing. Not abruptly, gradually. Each year, my range of options felt slightly smaller. Not because they were taken away, but because I no longer reached for them. I had trained myself not to expect much. That training worked too well. I started to feel grief, not for a specific loss, but for a version of myself I had never allowed to exist. Someone who tried. Someone who chose. Someone who risked being wrong instead of being absent. That grief came with anger. Not explosive anger, focused, inward anger. Anger at how compliant I had been. How easily I accepted a life that required so little of me emotionally. How often I told myself that discomfort meant something was wrong, instead of realizing it might mean something was true. I saw how often I had mistaken comfort for alignment. Just because something doesn't hurt doesn't mean it fits. That realization made it impossible to keep pretending. I started noticing moments where I felt detached from my own actions. Conversations where I heard myself speaking and wondered who I was trying to convince. Plans I followed through on without any sense of ownership. Days that ended without a single moment that felt intentional. I wasn't depressed. I was disengaged. And disengagement, I learned, is more dangerous than unhappiness. Unhappiness pushes you to change. Disengagement teaches you to tolerate. The moral dilemma became unavoidable. Do you keep going like this, functional, stable, disconnected, because changing now feels reckless and late? Or do you disrupt a life that works to pursue something undefined, knowing you might lose comfort, approval, and the illusion that you did everything right? Neither option felt good. Staying meant accepting that this numbness would be permanent. That I would keep aging inside a life that never quite belonged to me. That one day I would look back and realize I had survived instead of lived. Leaving, or changing, meant facing uncertainty I had avoided my entire life. It meant admitting that my carefulness hadn't been wisdom. That my restraint had cost me something real. It also meant confronting a terrifying thought: what if I try now, and nothing changes? What if I discover that the emptiness isn't circumstantial, but internal? That fear kept me frozen longer than I want to admit. Because as long as I didn't act, I could believe the story that potential still existed. That something meaningful was waiting just out of reach. Action would force an answer. Waiting preserved hope. But hope without movement turns into regret. I began to understand that I hadn't been unlucky. I had been absent. Life hadn't passed me by. I had stepped aside and let it. That realization was painful, but it was also clarifying. For the first time, the problem was visible. And visible problems, unlike vague dissatisfaction, can be confronted. I stopped asking myself what I should do next. Instead, I asked a different question: what am I afraid will happen if I actually choose? The answer was immediate. I was afraid of discovering that my life would finally be my responsibility. No excuses. No momentum to hide behind. No quiet agreement with time to decide for me. Just me, choosing, and living with the consequences. That fear had kept me passive for years. But now it had nowhere left to hide. Because continuing like this wasn't neutral anymore. It was a choice. And it was choosing for me. The moment I stopped letting my life happen didn't feel dramatic. There was no announcement. No clean break. No surge of confidence. It felt small. almost insignificant. I made one decision, not a life-changing one, not even a brave one, just a decision that was mine. Not inherited. Not expected. Not chosen by momentum. And the strangest thing happened. Nothing exploded. The world didn't punish me. Everything didn't suddenly fall apart. What changed was quieter, and far more unsettling. I felt present. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my own choice settle into my body. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't euphoric. It was heavy, grounding, undeniable. I couldn't say this just happened to me anymore. I had done this. And that responsibility terrified me, but it also woke me up. I started noticing how often I had used passivity as protection. How, letting things happen, had allowed me to avoid disappointment, blame, and ownership. If something went wrong, it wasn't my fault, I had just gone along with it. If something felt empty, I could tell myself it wasn't really my choice anyway. That illusion ended the moment I chose. Because choice makes you visible to yourself. There was no instant transformation. No sudden passion or clarity. What there was instead was friction. Resistance. Doubt. The constant urge to retreat into old habits, to let momentum take over again. Letting life happen is easy. Living is not. Living demands presence even when things feel uncertain. It demands staying when discomfort arises instead of numbing it. It demands that you accept responsibility not just for failure, but for meaning. I realized then how much I had underestimated myself. Not in terms of potential, but in terms of endurance. I had believed I couldn't survive the discomfort of choosing wrong. But what I had survived instead was far worse, decades of emotional absence. A life that never collapsed because it was never fully inhabited. I began to make choices that felt awkward, imperfect, and late. Some were small, saying no when I meant no, speaking honestly when silence felt safer. Others disrupted routines I had mistaken for identity. Each one cost me something. Comfort. Approval. The ease of blending in. But each one gave me something too. A sense of authorship. I stopped asking whether my life looked right and started asking whether it felt honest. Some days the answer was still no, but at least the question belonged to me now. That changed everything. I felt grief often. Grief for lost years. For versions of myself that never had the chance to exist. For paths that would never reopen because time doesn't rewind for clarity. I didn't fight that grief. I let it sit beside me. Because grief meant I was finally acknowledging that my life mattered enough to mourn. I also felt anger, not at anyone else, but at the quiet bargain I had made with comfort. The deal where I promised not to want too much in exchange for not being disappointed. That bargain had kept me safe. It had also kept me small. I didn't become fearless. I became honest. Honest about how often I wanted to disappear instead of decide. Honest about how seductive numbness can be. Honest about how easy it is to confuse stability with fulfillment. I learned something important: life doesn't require you to be extraordinary to feel meaningful. It requires you to be present. To choose even when you're unsure. To stay even when escape feels easier. I still feel the pull of passivity sometimes. The temptation to let days blur again, to stop asking questions, to let time decide. But now I recognize that pull for what it is. Not peace. Avoidance. I don't measure my life by milestones anymore. I measure it by moments of engagement. By how often I notice myself saying yes or no consciously. By whether I can recognize myself in my own decisions. Some days are quiet. Some are uncomfortable. Some feel unfinished. But they feel lived. And that makes all the difference. If you're listening to this and you feel like your life is happening to you instead of with you, hear this clearly: you don't need to burn everything down. You don't need a dramatic escape. You don't need permission to choose late. You only need to stop pretending that non-decision is neutral. It isn't. It's a choice that time is happy to make for you. I let my life happen instead of living it. And one day, quietly, painfully, I realized that was the greatest risk I had ever taken. Living didn't begin when everything made sense. It began the moment I decided to be there.